In 30, we begin with the statement of the sages and the ethics of the fathers. And the ethics of the father says, the hevei shval ruach, a person should be humble and should be low, literally, shval ruach, a low spirit, bifnei kol ha'adam, in front of every person. In other words, what the ethics of the father says, whenever you walk down the street, you see anybody, you should think of yourself as lower than that person. And Rabbi Shneur Zalman says we have to take this seriously, because if the ethics of the father says that you should be humble before every person, that means you should be humble before every person. So how does that mean? How can I be humble before the greatest sinner? And then Rabbi Shneur Zalman is going to, the Tanya chapter 30 is going to explain the statement. And in some sense, I'm worse than everybody I look at. What's the purpose? The purpose is to another way of showing myself, of breaking the self. Because I could have learned chapter 29 and say, yeah, I'm very low, but I'm better than the guy next to me. Chapter 30 says, no, you're not better than the guy next to you. Anybody, no matter how bad the guy is, you're not better than him. And that all serves as the breaking of the soul, breaking of the ego, which will allow next week we go from apathy to sadness to joy. That's the process. And that's what Rabbi Shneur Zalman told us he would do in 26, because he started out with the verse that says, B'chol etzav yeh motar, in every sadness there's advantage. So why are you telling me that you can never be sad? Because Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, no, but that verse itself tells you that sadness itself is not good. It's only the advantage that will follow the sadness. So that's what we're doing here. That's what we're engaged in doing. So the first thing is, so it's going to be a sad, in other words, it's going to be a little heavy chapter. But on the other hand, we discussed last week that this also highlights that everything Rabbi Shneur Zalman is telling myself how less than perfect I am, I only focus that judgment towards self, never towards somebody else. Because as we're going to see in this chapter, the defense of the other person, even the greatest sinner, the defense of this person is going to be profound. And therefore, I don't know what's going on with the other person. And therefore, I can never think of myself better than anybody else. Even if I see the person doing things that are wrong and bad, see that he's a bank robber, still I have to think of myself not as good as he. How is that? So the big idea here that Rabbi Shneur Zalman is going to put forth, the big idea here is that you don't look at the action. You have to look at the struggle and the effort that it takes to produce this action. In other words, if somebody else sins, I say, well, maybe the circumstances that he is in, maybe the temptation that he's surrounded with causes him to sin. Now, that's no excuse for him, because he is supposed to control himself the way we said at the Bain, he can control thought, speech, and action. But for me, I can't say I'm better than him because my circumstances is completely different. I, first of all, may not be surrounded by the same temptation. And even if you say I am, maybe my nature is not as his. Maybe naturally he is drawn to temptation more than I am because I'm by nature more cool. So what are you going to say? You're going to say, yeah, the other person sinned more? Yes, but you have to take into account how much challenge, how much difficulty he is facing. And because if he sins and I don't, it doesn't mean I'm better than him. It just means that my circumstances and my nature don't cause me to sin. That's point one. Point two, that we're going to say, Rabbi Shneur Zalman is going to say, I have to ask myself, am I investing in my service of God the same amount of effort that is required of the other person not to sin? In other words, when I do a positive mitzvah, when I pray, when I say the grace after meals, when I give charity, do I invest as much energy necessary as much energy as that person, and is necessary for that person to not rob the bank? So in other words, the big idea here is don't look at what you're doing and what the other person is doing. Look at what challenges that person faces. And then ask yourself, can I be confident to consider myself better than the other person? Could I be confident that I invest in my service of God the same effort that is required of him? And that's the big idea of the whole chapter. So it's not a long introduction. And again, what's the overarching purpose of all of this? First of all, to explain in other words, what we're doing is explaining the Mishnah and the ethics of the fathers. How is it possible that I should truly be more humble than anybody, even somebody who's a terrible sinner? Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, yeah, he's a sinner, but maybe that's his nature, and maybe that's his circumstances. Now, it's not a justification for him, as Rabbi Shneur Zalman says right away. Not a justification for him. He has to overcome his temptation. But for me, can I consider myself better than him if I'm not in his place? Because with Ethics of the Fathers again says, don't judge a person until you reach his place. Rabbi Shneur Zalman defines place as, first of all, a physical place. Maybe he's surrounded by temptation. But also figurative place, maybe his nature is more susceptible to temptation. So that's the big idea. So the big idea, again, is to explain how I have to be humble before every single person. That's another way of breaking my own ego. I can't consider myself better than the guy next to me, right? Sometimes I'm so bad, I say, my circumstance is not great, but I say, you know what? At least I'm better than the guy next to me. And that sort of keeps me complacent, right? And what we're trying to do is smash the complacency. So even if you study chapter 29 and you say, wow, I'm so bad, but at least I'm the best guy in the synagogue. So chapter 30 says, no, my friend, you can't do that, because the Ethics of the Father says that Sages teaches you have to be humble before every single person. And therefore, you cannot consider yourself greater than anybody. And what that's going to do, hopefully, is shake you out of the complacency, make you sad and bitter because of your distance from God. And then 31 will show how to transform the negative energy into positive energy. But before we do that, we first have to create negative energy. And the big problem here is that apathy. And that's what 29 and 30 is coming out with, a very strong, potent medicine. Don't take, in other words, we would never use this. We would never tell this to myself just to break my ego, to put myself down. Only in most extreme cases. It's like chemotherapy. You're not going to use it. It's destructive, but you only use it when you have to, when the alternative is worse. And the alternative for not having this sadness would be apathy, would be what he called timtum halev, a clogged heart where there's no emotion whatsoever. So we have to battle that by shattering the ego, creating a sense of sadness and bitterness. And next week in 31, we show how that sadness itself is actually what intensifies the joy that we're going to experience going forward. So that is the introduction. We'll read it inside. Again, it's spelled out very beautifully and very nicely. It's not very, the Alter Rebbe was an amazing writer. And as long as he's not talking too much Kabbalah, it's very easy to understand what he's saying. Once he gets to the Kabbalah, then it gets a little difficult, but I think it's an easy chapter. Easy to understand what he's saying. To implement it, maybe a little bit harder. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's a beautiful introduction. Looking forward to reading. I'm hoping to find the answer to the question. Is there a positive side effect of that process, feeling yourself lower than anybody else? Because the positive side effect of that is not to get upset of other people's actions, because you never know their nature and circumstances. So that's another positive spin on that.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of, when the sages said, be humble before everybody, they didn't necessarily say it in this context alone, so that you should be humble, so that you should be sad, so that you shouldn't have apathy. They were saying in general, it's a good, humility is a very good trait, because it's true. Part of this, a lot of arrogance is simply arrogance is simply, what's the word I'm looking for? It's simply not true. The fact that I consider myself better than my neighbor, by any measure that I decide is the measure to decide that I'm better than my neighbor, it's objectively, it's probably not true. So to be grounded and to be humble is a beautiful value. But what Rabbi Shneur Zalman is saying is, if you really think deeply about this, what it's also doing is going to make you feel that you are sort of the lowest of the rung. If I have to be humble before everybody, then I'm the lowest. And hopefully that sense will shake me out of complacency. So usually you don't have to think about that I'm the lowest. I don't have to think about every guy on the subway train, I'm worse than every guy on the subway train. Not necessarily. So I don't have to take it to the extreme. So usually what it is, if I have to keep my ego in check, I remind myself of this concept. And that's actually a very healthy thing, because if my ego is in check, then my life is more in balance, because the ego blinds a person's objectivity and makes the person arrogant, and you don't want to be next to an arrogant person. So yes, that teaching could have many positive side effects for a person's life. But to take the teaching to the extreme, in other words, if you really follow the logic of the teaching of the sages, that I be humble before everybody, and really think about and say there's, I don't know how many billion people we have now. There's 7 billion people on the planet, and I should be humble before everyone. In other words, it's possible that every single guy on this planet is ahead of me, taking that to the extreme. Oh, that's heavy. And that I would only do if I need to shake myself out of my complacency. But if I don't, if I'm just a normal day riding Metro North to Manhattan, I don't have to think of myself, I'm worse than every single guy on this train. No, but if I'm sitting and I have a relationship with somebody, and there's an interaction, and I feel greater than the other person, I say, relax, you're not greater than the other person. But do I sit and think about that I'm literally the worst guy in town? No, I don't have to think about it that way, even though in some sense it's true. But why focus on that? It's not productive. It's not positive. But sometimes, yes, you have to shake yourself. And you have to smash the log, because the log is not catching fire. And no matter what you'll meditate about, it's not igniting the heart. So what does the Zohar says? Go to your basement, get your axe, and splinter the beam. That's what the Zohar says to do. So that's what we have to do. And when we do that, we pull out the teachings of the sages, which, as you correctly point out, it has very many positive side effects. How to be humble, how to be respectful of other people, how to understand, not be judgmental, like Bob said. You know, the Chabad spirit is, if you see somebody, even if he doesn't look like he's connected to Judaism, you should respect that person, and you should not judge them, because who are you to judge? You don't know what their circumstances are. So there are many positive side effects to this teaching. But I think that the way we're using it here is extreme. We're literally telling you, follow this logic to the end and say, I am humble before every single person, meaning every single person is ahead of me. Meaning, you can't be comfortable. Part of being complacent is being comfortable. I say, okay, I'm bad, but I'm not that bad. I'm ahead of the other guy. You know what the joke is? The joke is that two guys are camping in the woods, and all of a sudden they see a beer ahead of them. So one of them puts on. They weren't camping. They were camping. They set up camp. So they're sitting and they're eating dinner. And then two guys and they see a beer. And one guy starts tying his sneakers. So his friend says, "What are you tying your sneakers? You can't outrun a beer." So the guy says, I don't have to outrun the beer. I just have to outrun you, right? So that's the point is. The point here is, I maybe before God, I'm nothing, but before you, oh, I'm better than you. I'm ahead of everybody else. So that's the complacency. So what are you going to tell him? Tell him chapter 29 that I'm very low before God. Okay, doesn't matter, but I'm ahead of the other guy. So that keeps me complacent. So chapter 30 grabs me and shakes me up and says, no, we're going to smash your complacency. You're not better than the other guy, and you're not better than any guy. Oh, that's severe. Okay, we're just about ready to jump in. Don't forget to stop me if you have any comments or questions, because that will make it a lot more So the beginning of the chapter is 30. In addition to that, so now in the English translates, remember the bold is the words of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the regular letters are the commentary. I sometimes skip the commentary if it's too long. One who suffers from timtum halev, which is the clogged heart, which is where the heart does not ignite with the passion, must also set his heart to fulfill the instruction of the sages. Be lowly of spirit before every man. The Rebbe had a whole talk. Every man means not only every Jew. That in rabbinic literature, when it says Adam, it could mean just a Jew. But when it says Ha-Adam, it means every man, meaning every human being. So I have to be lowly of spirit before every human being. Now, says Rabbi Shneur Zalman, that doesn't mean you should act like I'm humble. No, you should actually have to be. That's what Rabbi Shneur Zalman says. The wording implies be thus, and do not merely act thus, in all sincerity. In other words, truthfully, you have to see yourself as lower than every single person. So when you say the have a be, we mean it literally. And when we say before every person, we also mean that literally, every person. In the presence of every man, even in the presence of the most religiously irreverent people. Kal Shabakam, they have no reverence of heaven at all. They do whatever they want. Yes, I have to be humble before every person, even them. How so? How is that possible? This can be accomplished by following the instructions of our sages. Judge not your fellow man until you have stood, i.e., placed yourself in his place. Right? You can't judge a fellow until you stand in his shoes. And you know the good news is not the good news. You can't stand in a person's shoes. You don't ever know the other person's circumstances. Again, that's also from the ethics of the fathers. So Rabbi Shneur Zalman explains, what does it mean his place? Don't judge a person until you reach his place. So we're going to start with the literal place. For it is literally his place, i.e., his physical environment that causes him to sin. since his livelihood requires him to go about the marketplace all day. And whenever he is not thus engaged, he is of those who sit at the street corners. Thus his eyes see all the sorts of temptation, and what the eye sees, the heart desires. Additionally, his evil nature burns like a baker's fiery oven, which is a quote from the Bible, which is heated with greater frequency and intensity than the domestic oven. As it is written in Hosea, it burns like a flaming fire. In other words, this person, for whatever reason, I have the luxury, I sit in my office and I whatever I do. But this guy has to be in the street and he sees all the temptation. And his nature, his heart is burning like a fiery oven, but not a regular oven, a baker's oven. Could you imagine? It is different, however, with he who goes about but little in the marketplace. And most of the day, he is at home rather than at the street corners. And he therefore encounters less temptation, right? You build yourself an environment that's less tempting, which is, by the way, what you should be doing, right? What did I say? You don't want to, part of impulse control is really controlling your environment, right? If I buy the donuts and I put them on the counter, it's a matter of time before I succumb. If I want to create an environment where I live a healthy lifestyle, I have to remove the temptation. So that's the smart thing to do. So I stay away from the temptation of the markets. Even if I go, I only go there temporarily. In other words, for a short period of time. And now, even if you say, well, I work in the marketplace, so I'm exposed to all the temptation. So maybe I'm not as bad as the other guy. He said, no, the other guy's nature may be different than you. So that's what Rabbi Shneur Zalman continues. Even if he does go about the marketplace all day, so that his physical place is the same as that of the Kalshav Lakalim. Kalshav Lakalim is the person who has no reverence of heaven whatsoever. It may be that his spiritual place is different in that he is not so passionate by nature and is therefore not as greatly tempted by the sights of the marketplace. For the evil impulse is not the same in everyone. One person's nature may be more passionate and the others less so, as explained elsewhere. In other words, what are we saying here? We're saying, how can I be humble before every single person, even someone completely irreverent of God? Answer is, look at what the sages taught. Do not judge a person until you stand in his place. What's his place? So we said two definitions. One definition is his physical space. He is in the marketplace exposed to more temptation. The second place is, even if I happen to be, my booth in the marketplace is right next to his. So I see whatever he sees. Yes, but your nature is different. So we're talking about a spiritual place. The makeup of your soul, of your passions are different. Now Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, by the way, lest the irreverent person pick up a copy of the Tanya and read chapter 30 and say, oh, I'm exempt. I am exposed to temptation and I have a passionate nature, so I can do whatever I want. Since Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, no, that's no excuse for that guy. In truth, even he who is extremely passionate by nature and whose livelihood obliges him to sit all day in the street corners, he has no excuse whatsoever for his sins, and he is termed a Rasha Gamur, an utter evildoer, for not having the dread of God before his eyes. In other words, this person, even if you have a passionate nature and you're exposed to temptation, you could control, it was the whole thesis of the book so far, that you're a Beinoni, you can control what you think about. And therefore, you could think about the fact that God is in your presence, and therefore you won't sin. For he should have controlled himself and restrained the feeling of desire in his heart because of the fear of God, who sees all his actions. For as explained above, the mind has supremacy over the heart by nature of one's birth. So in other words, yes, what we're saying is we're using this idea, which is a true idea. It's the truth. The truth is that person has greater temptation than I. That person has a bigger challenge than I. So I cannot consider myself better than him, even if he succumbs and I don't. Does that mean it's an excuse for him? No. But I cannot consider myself better than him. Now Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, again, you understand that for what the Torah requires of that person who's exposed to temptation and who has a very passionate nature, the Torah requires of him not to sin, which means to exert a tremendous amount of effort not to sin. Now the question is, can I ask myself, do I invest that same amount of effort in my service of God? Maybe I'm not sinning, but am I investing that same effort in the positive mitzvot? And probably the answer is no. So how can I consider myself better than that person? Says Rabbi Shneur Zalman, truly it is a great fear struggle to break one's evil nature, which burns like a fiery flame for the fear of God. Indeed, it is like a veritable test. It's a very difficult test because it's ongoing and it's very difficult. Therefore, every man ought to weigh. In other words, I'm the person with the clogged heart. I have to look at myself and I want to shadow myself. So I say, I'm worse than every person. How do I do this? I have to ask myself. Every man ought to weigh and examine his own position according to the standards of his place and rank in divine service. as to whether he serves God in a situation requiring a comparable struggle in a manner commensurate with the dimensions of such a fierce battle and test of the Kal Shebakalim faces. Yes, the greatest sinner. Yes, it's required. He sins. He's a rasha. He's wicked. Why? Because the fact that he has temptation is no excuse. The fact that he's exposed to temptation is no excuse. And the fact that he has a passionate nature is no excuse. But then I ask myself, do I invest in my service of God what is required of him? In the realm of do good, in the service of prayer with kavanah, devotion, for example, he must battle his evil inclination daily in order to pour out his soul before God with his entire strength, to the extent of wringing out the soul, i.e. exhausting all of his intellectual and emotional power in his devotion. When I pray, do I pray with that as much intense devotion, which requires difficulty as the same difficulty as is required of that person not to sin? This battle must be waged both before, i.e. preparatory to, and also during prayer as follows. He must wage a great and intense war against his body and animal soul within it, which impedes his devotion, crushing and grinding them like dust every single day before the morning and evening prayers. If you want to pray properly, you have to shatter the animal soul before you pray, because the animal soul, as soon as you start praying, starts thinking about everything else in the world. So that's in preparation to prayer. Also during prayer, he must exert himself with an exertion of the spirit and an exertion of the body, as will be explained further at length. Anyone who has not attained this standard of waging such a strenuous war against his body has not yet measured up to the quality and dimension of the war waged daily within the Kal Shebakalim against the evil nature, which burns like a fiery flame, so that it, the powerful evil impulse, be humbled and broken through the fear of God. If I did not put all that effort into my service of God in prayer, for example, then my service of God does not require the same devotion as that person as required of that person. So how can I compare myself to that person? So that was prayer. Now we're going to bring other examples. So too with one's kavanah and the grace after meals and the benedictions, whether those said prior to eating and those recited before performing a mitzvah. Every time I pray, every time I say the grace after meals, every time I make a blessing. Not to mention one's intention in performing of a mitzvah, that it is done solely for the sake of a mitzvah, i.e. for God's sake. This requires a still greater effort, and this one will surely find himself wanting. Similarly, with regard to the battle required to the matter of one's occupation in Torah study. Yes, Torah study. I study Torah every day. Wonderful. The question is, am I studying more than my nature? Not a little bit more than my nature. Am I studying a lot more than my nature, requiring the same level of exertion that is required of the sinner who is in a place of temptation and has a passionate nature? Right? So that's what we're saying now. Similarly, with regard to the battle required to the matter of one's occupation in Torah study, one must struggle to study far more than what is demanded by his innate and accustomed desire by means of a mightily battle with his body. For to study a fraction more than his one's want, than his one's won't entails, but a minor tussle. It neither parallels nor bears comparison with the war of the Kal Shebakalim against his evil impulse, which burns like fire, for which he is nonetheless called utterly wicked, Rasha Gamor, if he does not conquer his impulse, so that it be subdued and crushed before God. In other words, the other person, we say, if you don't overcome your passion and your environment and have a tremendous battle against your nature to refrain from sin, then you're wicked. But then I ask myself, have I exerted that much effort in the positive, in the way I pray, in the way I say the grace after meals, in the way I study Torah more than my nature? And now you're going to say, well, yeah, but that person is sitting, is robbing a bank. I'm just not benching with the most intensity. Says Rabbi Shnezan, what's the difference? There's no difference between negative mitzvah or positive mitzvah. Both are the will of the king. He's not doing the will of God, and I'm not fully doing the will of God with that same battle. What difference is there between the category of turn away from evil, in which the Kal Shebakalim fails to by active violation, and the category of do good? What's the difference? Both are the commandments of the Holy One, of the Holy King, the only and unique one, blessed be He. Now we're going to move from prayer and focus in prayer to action, to charity. Yeah, I give charity. Do I give charity till it hurts? In other words, do I give charity to a place where it's uncomfortable, and with that same level of effort required of the sinner refraining from sin? So too with other commandments requiring a struggle. One may find that he does not wage war adequately against the evil impulse, especially in matters involving money, such as the service labor of charity, i.e. giving charity in a manner involving labor far more than is his want, and the like. So that's the first thing. I am not investing in my positive service of God as much effort as that Kal Shavakani person who's completely irreverent. And now we're going to say, even within the idea of separating from negativity, even I don't separate away from that negativity with the same intensity as the other person. In other words, yeah, maybe that person is doing a more severe sin, and my sin is less severe. But again, am I investing as much effort? And you're going to, and Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, even in a matter of negativity, I don't separate. I don't invest the same amount of effort. What are the examples? So let's see. Even in the category of turn away from evil, every thinking man can discover within himself that he does not turn completely and totally away from evil. In a situation requiring a battle of the level, i.e. magnitudes described above, in the battle required of the Kal Shabakalim, or even in a situation requiring a battle of lesser magnitude. In other words, even if the battle does not require as much effort as that sinner, even so, I'm not adequately investing the proper energy and the proper efforts. For example, what's an example of something that would be not a terrible sin, but it's a negative thing, and I'm not investing as much effort? For example, he may find that he does not summon up the strength to stop in the middle of a pleasant gossip or in the middle of relating a tale describing his fellow as he ought to do, even if it is a very slight slur, and even if it is to be true, and even though his purpose is in relating is to exonerate himself. In other words, sometimes it's a matter of speech, a slander of somebody else, even if it's true. And sometimes I'm doing it to exonerate myself, but it's a small sin, but we're not supposed to do that. Do I invest all that effort not to succumb to those small sins? Then he brings another example from the Talmud, as is known from Rabbi Shimon, said to his father Rabbeinu HaKadosh, this is in the Talmud, concerning a problematic bill of divorce that was improperly written. So the son told the father, I did not write it, Yehuda the tailor wrote it, where the slur was a minor one, and the purpose was self-vindication. And yet his father replied, keep away from slander. Okay, so the point here is, it's not a terrible sin, but it is but I can ask myself, not only so the first point we said is, do I invest that effort in my positive service of God? In other words, in the mitzvot requiring, in the positive mitzvot, but also do I invest that same effort in separating from negativity, maybe minor negativity, but it's still negativity. This is especially true with regard to sanctifying oneself by refraining from indulging in permitted matters. And this is a biblical commandment derived from the verses, you shall be holy and sanctify yourselves. So a person could say, person is required to separate from indulgence, unless the indulgence is for the service of God, as we discussed in chapter 7. Because that's a biblical commandment, not to indulge unless it's for a higher purpose. And some people say it's biblical. Now we're going to say, even according to the people that say that that's rabbinic, still, in some sense, the rabbinic commandments are more important than the biblical commandments, as the Medrash describes. Moreover, even according to the opinion that this commandment is not biblical, is not a biblical origin, yet rabbinic enactments are often stricter than biblical laws, and one will often find himself succumbing to self-indulgence when the temptation is strong and requires a battle to overcome it. Ella, but all these and similar matters are among the sins which people trample underfoot, insensitive to their importance, and which have come to be regarded as permissible because they are committed repeatedly. So these are mitzvot that, for whatever reason, people don't consider this a big deal. But just because people don't consider them a big deal, it's still a big deal. And that's what Rabbi Shneur Zalman is saying. Am I investing in my service of God, both in the positive realm? What am I doing in my prayer, in my intention when I say a blessing, in the charity that I give? That's the positive. But also the negative. Do I separate from even small amounts of slander or slight degrees of slander? Do I separate that from them when there is temptation and when it's difficult? Now Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, yeah, the sin may be smaller, but the fact is that if I am more learned, then more is required of me, right? You have a child breaks a vessel. Okay, he doesn't understand the value of the vessel. Even if he broke it on purpose, he doesn't understand the value of it. So if someone who sins, but he doesn't understand the value of keeping the Torah, okay, so it's bad, but it's not as bad as someone who understands the value of Torah and doesn't do everything right. Because the more I know, the more is required of me, the more I appreciate I have the potential to appreciate the holiness of the Torah. So again, this is another realm of saying that I'm actually worse than everybody, including the sinner. Because what are you going to say? I'm more learned? Yeah, if I'm a scholar, then more is required of me. The other person who doesn't understand the true value of the Torah, so So he doesn't sin. He succumbs, first of all, because of his nature. Second of all, because of his position, the place where he is. Third of all, because, and now we're saying he also doesn't appreciate this. He doesn't understand the value. In truth, however, if he is a scholar and upholds God's Torah and wishes to be close to God, his sin is unbearably great and his guilt is increased manyfold for his not waging war and not overcoming his impulse in a manner commensurate with the quality and nature of the war mentioned above. His guilt is far greater than the guilt of the Kal Shebakalim, the most worthless of the street corner squatters who are remote from God and his Torah. But because they're so remote from God and the Torah, then that's also the defense. Their guilt for not summoning up the fear of God, who knows and sees all their actions in order to restrain their impulse, which burns like a fiery flame, is not as heinous. Why not? As the guilt as one who draws ever nearer to God, his Torah and his service. As our sages of blessed memory say of the apostate Acher, Elisha ben Avuda, because he knew my glory, said God, if despite this he still sinned, his guilt is far greater. Therefore, our sages declared in regard to the illiterate, this is a beautiful statement, that deliberate sins are regarded in their case as inadvertent acts, since they are unaware of the gravity of their sins. So someone who's not learned, even if they're doing something on purpose, it's still considered a mistake, right? They smashed a vessel. Yeah, but they don't understand that it's worth $1 million. And the continuation is, but sages, even what they do by mistake, is considered doing it on purpose. Because if you knew the importance of the vessel, if you knew how important this is, you have to be far more sensitive. So that is chapter 30 in short. And if it gave you a little wake up, then that was exactly the point. In other words, we're bringing the axe to the log. We're splintering the log. We're telling the person, you're not just low before God, but you're actually low before every other person on this planet. You could think of yourself as worse than that person. But how so? Is not one guy that I'm better than? No, because if you're better, first of all, at the end is if it's better, it could be worse where it works against you. The more you know, the more is required of you. But the real question is, I'm doing everything right. I'm living in a healthy lifestyle where there's not a lot of temptation and not a lot of opportunity to sin. That's good. That's wonderful. But if you have to break yourself, you say, well, am I investing that same effort required of the person facing temptation, surrounded by temptation all day, with a passionate nature? And the Torah requires of that person a tremendous battle to overcome his own impulses and sins and not to sin. Am I investing that same effort and battle in my service of God? And even if you say that I am, that person succumbs, but that person doesn't understand the value of the Torah. So it's considered inadvertent, even if he does it on purpose. So the bottom line is, I could see myself lower than every single person. And that we just shatter the vessel. We just shatter the complacency. If I take this seriously, I'm gonna become sad. And Rabbi Shneimeh Zalman says, you're sad? Mazel tov. Now we can go to chapter 31 and transform the sadness to joy. Because before we read chapter 29 and 30, you were not sad. You were just a lump of clay. In other words, you're just a beam of wood. We could not get the fire. I'm sitting with a blowtorch on this wood. It's not catching. So we got to chop it up. That's sadness. And once we get the sadness will transform to joy. So if you want to transform the sadness to joy, see you here next Friday, 10 o'clock in good health. Thank you all for joining. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Feldman. It's so inspiring, this chapter. But the question remains: in an effort to control your own environment, what if you encounter a person who is either uneducated or doesn't control his own environment and creates a lot of discomfort, to say the least, in your life? So, are you supposed to distance yourself to protect your own environment?
Yeah.
Or what is the course of action? Does he talk about it anywhere?
So he doesn't talk about it explicitly here, but he does say that if my livelihood is to earn a living in the market with this temptation, that's considered a test. That's considered a test. Now, we ask God, don't bring me to a test. In other words, we don't want to put ourselves in a situation where we're tested in this way, where we have to every single day face temptation. So we're not supposed to put ourselves in this situation, and we're supposed to try to protect ourselves from that situation whenever possible. If it's impossible, then that's not a reason to sin. That's not a reason to succumb. So in other words, what we're saying here is not that I should put myself in a test to see if I'm better than the irreverent person. No, we're saying you protect your environment. You create an environment where there's not a lot of temptation. And then ask yourself, am I investing that same passion in the positive? Now, sometimes I have no choice. The only place I can make a living is in a place of temptation. Okay, fine. So that's God telling me that's my place. And that's my place. But I should know I have the power to overcome the temptation. Or the challenge, or whatever, you're speaking more broader about challenge. But this doesn't contradict what the sages say in general is, yes, try to stay away from temptation whenever possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bob, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. Wonderful as always. Now, again, just to play devil's advocate here, I can't help but this has become a big bait and switch for me. This is a book appealing to my mediocre senses. I'm the Beinoni. I'm, I kind of a semi-good guy. I'm reading with joy. I get to chapter 29. I'm saying, well, did I pick up the wrong book? And then I read chapter 30 and I said, I'm definitely not into the right book. And part of me wants to just put it down and never get to chapter 31. I mean, shouldn't Rabbi Zalman have introduced these two chapters a little better, saying, hey, look, in an effort to make you better people, think about this. Or, suddenly this is sort of like the Tochacha, you get to a point in the Torah and everything is curse and sin.
Right.
Explain.
So I'm just going to give the pitch. I'm just going to try to see how I see it, and you tell me if this resonates. If it doesn't, that's okay. Then you'll give the pitch, and you tell me how it resonates. But what I'm trying to say is like this. One way to think of the Tanya, more than a book of philosophy, one way to think of the Tanya, it's really an instruction manual. Remember what it's here to replace. It's here to replace the private audience where the individual person has a question about his spiritual service of God, and he gets onto his horse and wagon if he's wealthy enough. If not, he walks to the town of Liadi and he says, I have a problem. I'm depressed. What should I do? I have a problem. I can't overcome my temptation. What should I do? So this is an instruction manual. And you're right that in some sense, Tanya till chapter 25, you finish the Tanya. You have all the tools you need. The TV, you set up the piece of technology. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. The problem is not the problem. I don't read instruction manuals, unfortunately, until it breaks. The problem is that instruction manual, at least the old ones, the new ones don't have any instructions. But in the old ones, the first 20 pages has how to operate the machine. And then you have troubleshooting. And chapter 26 is troubleshooting. Yes, I can guarantee you that if you're going to, because of the makeup of the two souls and because of the battle of the two souls, I can guarantee, so you don't need this. You don't need this on a day-to-day basis. So therefore, on a day-to-day basis, you study Tanya 1 to 25, and then 35 is going to be very important. 35 and on be very important. But you don't necessarily have to deal every day, wake up in the morning and you're feeling fine. You don't have to open up this chapter and say, what should I do? Potentially, I'm so sad. It's just going to make you more sad. But we reach the troubleshooting chapters of the Tanya. And this is a practical manual. You need the troubleshooting. And that's what Rabbi Shneur Zalman, he gives an introduction and he says, it's inevitable. And I guarantee you, if you're going to be alive for a few decades, some days you're going to be sad. And some days you're going to be complacent, and not just complacent, but emotionally complacent. In other words, emotionally lifeless. And Rabbi Shneur Zalman says, I cannot sell you a book that's incomplete if I just give you the theory. The theory is till chapter 25. This is the anatomy of the two souls, the spiritual anatomy of the two souls. This is how you win. This is the weak point of the animal soul. You can't get rid of him, but you can control thought, speech, and action. Know what you can do it, have a nice life. That would be a wonderful book, but in reality, there are challenges that we have to troubleshoot. And the most important one is sadness. And sometimes sadness is even a bigger problem, which is apathy, and sometimes we have to deal with that. Now, if you tell me when I wake up in the morning, chapter 30 is not the first chapter I want to read, I agree with you. But if you wake up in the morning and a person is feeling no emotion at all, and you go to the spiritual mentor, because Rabbi Shneur Zalman says in the beginning of the Tanya that you don't have to come to him. You can read the Tanya, and if you don't understand the Tanya, go to your spiritual mentor. So if I come to my spiritual mentor and I say, my friend, it's not that I'm feeling sad, it's I'm feeling nothing. He's going to say, I have an excellent reading for you. Read chapter 29 and 30. And then I'm going to come back to him and say, it was very effective. Now I'm feeling sad. He's going to say, oh, you won't believe it. I have an amazing chapter for you. It's called 31. And 31 will get you from the sadness to the joy. So you're right. In some sense, these chapters are troubleshooting chapters.
Okay,
don't know if that helps.
I buy it. I think he may have done a better job introducing this. I mean, saying here are the troubleshooting chapters.
Yes.
Just because it almost sounds like there's a different author.
Right. Yeah, and when Amy was here, we were talking about Musar. I don't know if you were on that time at the end because we stayed extra, but we say that, like he was saying, the other style of Musar. We said yes, when Rabbi Shneur Zalman wants to do Musar, he's very capable of doing it, and he's doing it right here, and it does sound like a totally out of character. And the answer is it is out of character because remember we're talking about the Hasidic movement, and the Hasidic movement is all about joy. And we're allergic to sadness. And that's the beginning of chapter 29. When chapter 26, even when Rabbi Shneur Zalman acknowledged the verse that says that there is advantage to joy, to sadness, Rabbi Shneur Zalman says that verse itself tells you sadness is not good. It just leads to an advantage. So we're coming from a culture that is really allergic to sadness. And here we're just piling on the sadness. And it is an exception to the rule, and it's only because like you said. So I'm not disagreeing with you, but part of your complaint is toward the Tanya teacher, which is in this case myself, that you have to really set it up in that way and say this is not the chapter that's going to inspire you. This is not the chapter that's going to change your life. This is the chapter. This is the troubleshooting chapter.
But he goes further. He goes further to say that sadness is almost a prerequisite to your future. You have to be sad.
Where I have no emotion. In the case where I have no emotion.
Okay.
In the case we have no emotion. In other words, typically I create energy through meditation, thinking about the closeness of God, thinking about the fact that I have an opportunity to connect to God. That's the meditation that brings love and joy. We said sometimes in 26, sometimes I have sad feelings. I'm a human being, so I have sad feelings. So we have to deal with those sad feelings. But now we're saying he'll never tell you to awaken sadness. He never told us to awaken sadness unless I feel nothing. That's the only time. It's only Timtum Alev. Only literally, I don't know if it sounds worse or better in the Hebrew, but Timtum Alev means I have a clogged heart. If I walk into your office and say, "Doctor, I have a clogged heart," you say, "Go to the emergency room," right? Because it's not good. So spiritually, in the spiritual, that's in the physical sense. In the spiritual sense, a clogged heart is the same thing. You got to do open heart surgery. You have to do something dramatic because a clogged heart is a clogged heart, and that's the worst you can get. And then we say, yes, when you have a clogged heart, do what you usually don't do. You're taking an element which is destructive. Think about chemotherapy. You're taking an element which is destructive and you're applying it. Why are you applying it? That would be insane. I'm applying it because I have a bigger problem. And then, hopefully, once I deal with the bigger problem, I come in and clean up the side effects of the negativity, which is the joy. But it's not just removing the side effects. This is what Rabbi Shneur Zalman said. The reality is that after the sadness, you can reach a greater level of joy. Now, you're right. Don't try it. Don't try it at home. Don't get sad to reach a greater level of joy that will follow us. We'll describe in 39 in 31. Don't try this at home. But if I came to my spiritual mentor and I say, I have a problem, I feel nothing, they'll say, oh, beautiful. I have the right book for you. It's called the Tanya, and I have the right chapter for you, which is 29 and 30.
Got it. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Wonderful Shabbos, everybody. And
you too.
Good news.
Chazak Baruch.
Chazak Baruch. Take care. Be well, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for joining.